Donald Trump has reignited global trade tensions by threatening to impose 50% tariffs on imports from the European Union. The American president accuses EU member states of using unfair trade practices against his country, including trade barriers, value-added taxes, monetary manipulation, and bringing unjustified lawsuits against American companies. His main complaint is that the EU is running a huge trade surplus against America and that negotiations to reduce this are going nowhere. US stocks have tumbled in response to the president's latest tariffs threat. Let's get more from Brussels correspondent Anshal Vohra. Welcome, Anshal. For now, we've only got the president's social media post saying he's recommending a 50% tariff on EU products. How seriously should we take this?
Well, that's very hard to say. It's very possible that he makes it official just to prove a point. It's also possible that he isn't happy with the EU's proposal on how to bridge this trade deficit. And either way, Phil, what we see is that both sides are trying to drive a hard bargain. The US president isn't happy. The EU isn't giving in either, unlike the UK. The UK, in its agreement with the US, has agreed to 10% baseline tariffs on all exports to the US, which is quite a big deal. But here in the EU, there is strong opposition to that. In fact, some member states have said that there will be countermeasures if the US says the 10% baseline tariffs will remain.
President Trump has alluded to those negotiations, describing them as very difficult and saying that they're going nowhere. Tell us more about those talks.
Well, essentially, the EU has said, fine, we're going to buy more energy from you. And that was one of the first demands made by US President Donald Trump. The EU has also indicated, let's deal with the Chinese overcapacity. China is a manufacturing giant. It produces more, drops the prices, sells more. That's bad both for the EU and US manufacturers. And the message from Brussels is let's work together on that front. But it doesn't seem to have resonated in Washington, which kind of makes people here think that they may have to expand the ambit of countermeasures here they've been threatening.
And one of the EU's problems in the past has been a disunity of voices. What's the situation now? Is there unity on this issue?
Well, officially there is unity, and the broad consensus is that when it comes to American tariffs, all member states are going to be presenting a united front, and they are. However, of course, different member states have different business interests with the US. So we are hearing murmurs of disagreement, particularly on, there are two sets of tariffs that the US has imposed. One is the 10 baseline tariff. That is, on any export to the US, there will be a 10% tariff blanket for all countries, all exports to the US, all imports into the US. And then there are sectoral tariffs. In the EU's case, it's 25% in key sectors like steel and cars. So different member states have different interests. Some are saying 10% baseline is fine. Let's try to convince Trump to take off the 25%. Others are saying the other way around, that it's more important to get rid of 10% because it's harder to convince Trump on the 25% sectoral tariffs.
OK, Anshal, thank you for that. Anshal Vohra in Brussels. Well, even before Donald Trump's latest announcement, his tariffs did actually come up in a phone call between Germany's new Chancellor, Friedrich Merz, and Chinese President Xi Jinping. Our political correspondent Simon Young can tell us more. Welcome, Simon. These are strange times, with the two leaders stressing the importance of their countries' relations in the face of uncertainty caused by the United States.
Well, Phil, I think it's natural for China and Germany to seek good relations. They have an important bilateral trading relationship, was worth about 250 billion euros last year. But of course, China and Germany are also still trying to get their heads round Donald Trump's changing tariffs. And both countries are big exporters to the United States as well, and they'd like it to stay that way. But the concern for Merz is that as a response to those US tariffs, China could even more go down the route of dumping cheap products on the European market, something the Europeans say is already happening. But this is why Friedrich Merz, in this telephone call with Xi Jinping, underlined the importance of a fair competition, as he referred to, and reciprocity. That's one of those terms that Donald Trump is also very keen on. The Chinese also talking about fairness and transparency in the relationship. So both countries have got similar concerns and they need to talk.
Right, Simon, young DW political correspondent. Dan DiFrancesco is deputy editor and anchor for the online program Business Insider. Welcome to DW. How seriously should we take Donald Trump's latest threats?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Well, I think, now that in the U.S., we've moved past the tax bill, it seems like we're back into tariff time. And we've seen this script before, right? President Trump comes out, complains about how negotiations aren't going the way he wants, talks about how things have been unfair for too long, sets a deadline, sets a very high tariff. But in the past, right, we've come to more compromises as far as it's never been as high. We already saw that with the China trade agreement that's, tentatively in place. Obviously, the UK also, there was a trade agreement made there. So as, shocking maybe as initially the Truth Post seemed, I think there's general expectations that it won't end up being where it is. And we're kind of already seeing that, at least in the US market, where although there was a big initial drop in some of the major indexes, things have started to come back. And the last thing I'll say on this is, if you want any other kind of consolation to feel a little bit better about this, you can look at the other announcement that came today, which was Donald Trump calling on Apple to make iPhones in the US. That's just something that, people in the know have said there's just no realistic expectation that Apple will ever be able to make iPhones in the US. So again, it's a lot of this negotiation that's been going on, this entire trade war, set the expectations high, come in hard, and then hope that, they can land somewhere in the middle.
He has complained about negotiating with the European Union, who seem to be very good and very tough at this. Do you expect, therefore, them to be moved by this?
I mean, it's tough when we've seen already historically with the China, although it's temporary agreement, with the UK agreement, with some of the stuff that's already gone on between Canada and Mexico and the US, that as hard as he comes out initially, eventually there is a come down. So I could see them playing a little bit more hardball than they have in the past. And it is kind of this game of boy who cried wolf. Like, if you continue to come out with these big outrageous tariffs, but then you end up landing not anywhere near what you initially set out, at some point, the people that you're calling out are going to call your bluff. So I think that will be interesting. But again, the fact that the market has recovered so much, there is, I think, an expectation that there will be some happy middle ground.
If we accept that the EU does export more goods to the US than it imports from there, is Donald Trump right about the cause of this imbalance, which he says are unfair trade practices in Europe?
Yeah, I don't know if that's completely fair, because you look at it like there's just some general themes that have always been going. One, I mean, Americans, right, like a lot of European goods, whether it's cars or fashion or wine, like that's not unfair trade practices. It's not a problem that someone wants to drive a BMW, right? That's just kind of the way of the world. Also, the U.S. buying power has been strong for a while. The dollar has been strong for a while. That's not necessarily bad business, trade tactics, so to speak.
So let me just interrupt you there and just throw some of his list at you, because he's complaining about value-added taxes. He says there's monetary manipulation and unjustified lawsuits against American companies.
Yeah, I know there's a lot of that going around, especially with some of the big tech and some of the crackdown that's come on Apple and whatnot. And I think, look, all this is a way for him to try to build a case to try to make the EU seem like the big bad boogeyman for U.S. consumers and that we're getting a raw deal. And we've seen that time again with all of this stuff. He's talked about fentanyl at the, Canadian and Mexican border and complaints about that. So it's kind of creating this big monster that's, trying to take down America, and why these tariffs need to be put in place. That's kind of the narrative for a while now with all of these arguments.
All right, thanks for talking us through that, Dan. Dan DiFrancesco from Business Insider.
Thanks so much.